Now, the last slide here before we see if there's any questions, there are many schools of thought on what goes on in the grief process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, maybe you read books by her, who wrote early on, did a lot of work, and then subsequently other people. This man, J. William Worden, he has written his own schools of thought. When you look at what Kubler-Ross said and others have said, it was more passive. There were phases. You went through one phase, you went through another phase, whatever. What his approach, Worden's approach, is rather than kind of like rolling from one phase to another, he's feeling there are four main tasks. He's sort of putting the ownership on you guys to say there are things you need to do to make yourselves get through this more easily. All right? Doesn't mean, as I said before, you do it alone, but I just highlight these, and there's more detail, and there's books on stuff like this, which I don't really like to get into too much. But the four tasks that he basically said, and some of these may sound almost silly, but they really are true. And when you see people, you may think of yourselves. The first one is just to simply accept that this really has happened. Now, intellectually, you know it, right? There's no doubt about it. But to accept it in our hearts is a very, very difficult thing and takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And I like to tell people that even though the proximity of the brain and the heart are not very far, it's a big gap in trying to, because the brain is constantly trying to talk the heart into things, and the heart's saying, you know, I really miss so-and-so, even though I know they really are gone. So that accepting the reality is much more oriented toward the heart in that respect. The second item is working. Now, these are, in a sense, sequential, but they all happen at similar, overlapping and things, and we can slide from one to the other. But the second item is trying to work through the pain. And as I said earlier on, and I'm going to say again, is that it's hard to avoid the pain, and it's not very healthy to avoid the pain. Not that we're trying to make you hurt, but the more we kind of suppress the pain and the more we kind of push it away, the more frustrated we can get, the more anxiety we can get. We could go into depression. There are a lot of things that can happen to us. And part of it is we know that we should express it. But again, what happens is around us, it's whether it's being accepted or not. And we're going to talk about that a little later. The third task is sort of learning to adjust to your environment without so-and-so there. All right? Whether that means, what did this person really do for me? And it gets, what I'll say, the trivial. They did the taxes, or they did, so those would be more on the trivial, although very important when they have to be done, side. But then maybe that's the person who really I felt I could always turn to. Maybe that's the person that affirmed me the most, et cetera, et cetera. And how am I going to get affirmation if this was the one person in my life that affirmed me? I mean, that's very hard. That's a very hard thing to figure out, how am I going to replace that, all right? And it becomes a very difficult task to try to work through. And then lastly, it's getting the energy up, getting whatever you want to call it together to try to get over that hump where I'm going to try to get on with my life in the sense of starting to do things again that I might have done with him or her or however that works. And in that 2 years that I talked about, you can imagine these things happen at different times, but they take a long time. And I'm not saying after 2 years people would be done with these by any means. It's not depending upon the situation. But certainly those would be the kinds of tasks that Worden would say, if we sort of work on these, then it will help us to traverse this particular path we're going on.